Part 100. After my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gongwei Pang. Chapter 1003. But even in a coma, she still clung to his chest tightly, not wanting to let go. Yuan Jingdi was very helpless, and he was afraid that his strength would be involved in the wounds of the dead person. Between this guy helped himself to block an arrow. He was very patient and squatted and let Yanj grab his clothes and whisper, calling out, "Come, help the general to heal the wound." He just shouted once, and the doctors were waiting outside the screen, and heard that they were busy entering. Several imperial doctors paid their respects to Emperor Yuanjing, and then the head of the sword dropped his head to check the wounds of Yanj. The injury was in the chest. Obviously, Yanj himself had already dealt with it slightly. Although he no longer bleeds, he still needed to pull out the arrow in time. The imperial doctor cautiously lifted the clothes of Yan Song. This time, hesitated, he hurriedly pulled up his clothes, kneeled down, turned his head and looked at Yuan Jingdi. Yuan Jingdi sees more clearly than he does. His head was rumbling like a thunder blast at the moment. How is this possible? Is he wrong? But my heart was wondering again, how could a man have such a chest? The imperial doctor yelled, "Your Majesty, her general." The voice of the imperial doctor called Yuan Jingdi's thoughts back. His frantic heart was settled afterwards. Yes, this is why she is not willing to let you heal the wounds. Only for this reason can a reasonable explanation be made. He glanced like a torch and waved his hand to let the doctors behind him retreat. Then he said, "Don't look at it, that you shouldn't look at it. I'll fight for you." Seeing Emperor Yuanjing being so calm, the imperial doctor could barely suppress his mind, although he was flustered, and he bowed his head and said yes. Then he got up again and covered Yanj's chest with a piece of parchment. "The arrow is poisonous. Although she has taken the poison pill in time, she has taken the medicine herself. The poison has been dipped into the flesh. Your Majesty, when you pull out this arrow, you must scrape all the flesh and blood around you. Her Majesty will need to hold on to the general in case she will struggle with a second injury." Emperor Yuanjing nodded. From beginning to end, he seemed extremely calm. The pain of scraping the bones is painful. The two thought that such pain, even if Yanj was in a coma, they would struggle with pain. What they didn't expect was that, from beginning to end, the words were not struggling. Her hands were clenched tightly on the sheets, her teeth were covered with blood from her lips, her eyebrows were wrinkled tightly, and the sore corners burst into tears. However, she did not make a sound from beginning to end. Emperor Yuanjing was afraid that she would bite her tongue, and was busy putting a towel into her mouth. He stared at the tears that shed slowly in the corner of her eyes, and his outstretched hand stayed in the air for a short while before slowly retracting. "Fortunately, I just hurt my shoulder." Yu Yi breathed a sigh of relief afterwards, and looked up to see that Emperor Yuanjing was calm on the face, but his sweat was on his forehead. He whispered, "Your Majesty, the general is ill and needs clean up. But now that the general is a woman, this kind of thing must not be done by men." Yuan Jingdi swallowed back when he reached his mouth. He set out to set an example, and the people around him were all men, and there was no mother in the whole account. "You go down and let Xiao Qi prepare a hot towel to bring in. Xiao Qi is the father-in-law of Qi, and the only who came with him this time. He can only count half of his mother." The doctor nodded his head, his heart was completely relieved, and he immediately reclined his head outwards. When he left the door, his legs were unable to move immediately. After my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gongwei Pang. Chapter 1004. The royal doctor cleared the wounds of Yanj for a long time in the middle of the night. Yuan Jingdi had just returned from the battlefield and was tired. He persisted in the middle of the night and was sleepy and hungry. But he still resisted the fatigue caused by his body, and let the father-in-law Qi fight for him. He himself helped Yanj clean the body. This female body completely subverted his impression of the female body. Emperor Yuanjing thought that a woman's skin should be white without any flaws, and there should be pleasing appearance everywhere, like the painting of a courtyard in a royal garden and a vase on the bedside. Although women are good looking, they are all broken at the touch, and they are also a fragile thing. He has always been impatient with women. Mo said that helping a woman to wipe her body like that is in the bedroom, but if a woman slightly passes or slightly disobeys his mind, he can't immediately drag people out. The woman on the bed is not as good as the enemy on the battlefield will make him bloody. However, at this moment, the woman lying on the bed had numerous scars on her body. Although the skin was white and greasy under the clothes, the ugly scars on her body were even more eye-catching. His fingers couldn't help touching the scars on her. Several injuries were left by her when she followed him around. He only knew that she was brave and resourceful on the battlefield, and was a rare sword, but she never thought about it. She was a woman, and she had so many scars on her body. The scars were ugly, and the bumps and roughness of the scars could be felt after touching the fingers. The tears in the corners of her eyes had dried, but he reached out and touched the corners of her eyes. This woman completely exceeded his knowledge of women. It was simply incredible. Even if he touched it with his own hands and watched it with his own eyes, he knew unconsciously and asked in his heart, "This is really a woman? How could a woman give up the ease of living in the backyard and run into this battlefield where murder is not seen? How could there be a woman more brave than a man?" The mud on her body was no exception, even on her face. He helped her clean her face. Then, shocked in general, moved closer and glanced at her. Still belongs to her eyebrows, but it is not the same as usual. Her sword brow turned into a thin willow eyebrow, her tall nose seemed smaller than before. This face is closer to a woman's features. He shuddered, not expecting this woman to be so bold. But without any anger, he looked at this face with some novelty. As a man, her face was too small and her face was too round, but now she realized that this face is really suitable for women. About this real face is rarely exposed to the sun. Her skin is very good, she is fair and delicate, she is pure and flawless, her facial features are exquisite, she is more like the finest porcelain, and it does match her modeled body tune. His fingers pinched her chin. I want to keep this face little by little in my heart. With this pinch, she suddenly noticed that she still had a throat knot around her neck. The fingertips touched the thin cicada-like skin around her neck, and he gently tore off the skin. She can even fake her throat with falsehood, but there are other places to fake it. With that thought, he didn't even sleep. Putting her clothes on, he hugged him on the bed where he usually rested. He invited the doctor to come in and ordered a few times, and he went to bathe behind the screen. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. After my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gongwei Pang. Chapter 1005. In the sound of the water, Yuan Jingdi heard a few words from the bedside doctors reporting to him, Your Majesty, her buds used chi sage juice. This juice is slightly toxic. When it comes into contact with human skin, it can swell for 3 to 5 days. If it is weak, it will swell for more than half a month. Early bud juice was used on the eyelids as well as the cheeks on both sides, as well as the forehead. Although this kind of late bud grass juice will be slightly toxic when it comes into contact with human skin, it is easy to detoxify. Wipe it with impatience and it will fade in less than half an hour. Emperor Yuanjing pursed his lips and did not speak from beginning to end. After washing, there was still a little time before half an hour. After getting dressed, he went to the next room and summoned a few generals to discuss the arrangements for the next battle with the crowd. Sometime. The woman was in his head, but his thoughts were extremely clear. When he got up and left, several generals who had a good relationship with her asked her condition. Yuan Jingdi stepped a little and said, "He is still in a coma, the royal medical doctor will do his best. If you are really worried about her, the next battle, try your best." He did not say if he could survive. The hearts of everyone were very anxious, but because of the coldness of Emperor Yuan Jingdi, they didn't dare to ask more. He entered his room, his steady steps speeded up, and in a few steps he bypassed the screen and reached the bed. The imperial doctor had all left, and Xiao Lu saw him come in and retreated outside the door with interest. When he helped her clean her face, she thought her features were beautiful enough among women. But at this moment, when he saw the person on the bed, his beating heart was frozen for a moment, everything around him seemed to be far away from him, and it was only her face that caught his eyes. From childhood to age, the woman who impressed Yuan Jingdi really had none. The women in the harem look better and sweeter than one, but none of them can remember his face and name. He stared at the woman in front of him without blinking, as if using his eyes as a pen, little by little, engraving her appearance in his heart. Su was suffering from a sore wound, a sleeping song, and she snorted slightly, frowning. Yuan Jingdi heard her voice and took a step back subconsciously to find a place to hide, but found that there was something wrong with her movement, and she did not open her eyes. He was extremely surprised by his behavior. This is his room, this is his bed. He is an emperor, and she is still his general. Why should he hide? Su was breathing for this unexpected reaction to his heart, and he took a step forward and sat down beside the bed. Eyes fell on her face again, her fingers stretched out unknowingly, and rested on her slightly raised eyebrows. She has a small face, and this little face is completely different from her former handsomeness. The small face with large palms, thin and small lips, and the tip of the nose are pretty, and the thin eyebrows are raised slightly, making people want to smooth her brows. He was so fragile that it seemed like he could poke her with a little finger, and he didn't dare to force it. He even used her wide palm to make a gesture on her face, and compared to whether his hand was bigger than her face. He was doing such a naive approach. He didn't dare to imagine that lying on this bed, a fragile woman like a porcelain doll would be the sword he used for more than 5 years, or the Changsheng general he admired most. After my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gong Weipang. Chapter 1006. Why is she a woman? Yuan Jingdi carefully hugged her body on the inside of the bed, then lay down beside her and covered her with a quilt. He felt as if he knew for the first time that in this world, in addition to men and women, there was another person like her. Making him in front of her was a genuine surprise and admiration. A woman is still such a beautiful woman. Even if she finds a good husband's family, it will be very easy. But instead of staying with her husband and son in the backyard, she battled with a group of men on the battlefield. A woman has to stand on the battlefield many times more difficult than a man. But not only did she stand on the battlefield, but she also became famous and became a General Yan Luo who changed the color of personal talk. Obviously sleepy, tired, still couldn't help but look at her sideways. Later, she slept so close to her face. Tired Yuan Jingdi, he sleeps very well. When the eyes opened the next day, a woman's face was close at hand. After a brief surprise, the memory returned to the cage, he blinked, reached out, and touched her fair, thin, creamy face. So soft, so tender, and obviously no different from ordinary women, but he felt that the difference was very great. Her face, he wanted to touch it again, so staring at her without feeling tired. Yan Ji fell asleep in bed for 3 days. After 3 days at midnight, when he was sober, he shouted water subconsciously. Someone stood up and poured water for her, and helped her to sit up and feed her a small glass of water. She drank the water, and her thoughts became clear. When she lay down, she found that it was Yuan Jingdi who had fed her water. She widened her eyes in surprise, and said hoarsely, "Your Majesty." When she closed her eyes, Her facial features were very soft, like a sleeping beauty, and her eyes closed were so serene that it was pleasing to the eye. She opened her eyes were slender, her eyes were raised, her sleepy eyes looked like a little fox was hooking people. Now the eyes are widened, the eyes are as bright as the stars at night, the innocent and lovely. He even wanted to reach out and squeeze her fleshy cheek. He thought she probably didn't know that her own face had changed. So his heart tickled again, and he also put up with it, with a quiet sound, covered her quilt and asked her, "Does it hurt?" Yan Gemyu shook his head and said, "Your Majesty, why are you in front of my bed? This is not something you should do, it is a shame." The expression on her face was really vivid. He moved his fingers and couldn't pierce her. He said blankly, "You lie in your room and sleep in your bed." After that, he lay beside her and slept well. On one side, with a surprised look at Shang Yanj, Yuan Jingdi said slightly displeasedly, "The royal doctor said that your body is not suitable for movement, and you have the habit of finding a bed, but you can only aggrieve the general and asleep in a bed." At the end, he added with a solemn expression, "The general has objections." Yan Ji shook his head in a hurry, it was Chen's fault that dragged down his majesty, and Chen will work hard to get better. He heard her say such a few words, his chest was undulating, about injured, and he shouldn't talk much, so he interrupted her, "Sleep, there is something to call you." Before dawn, something happened to Yanj. She wants to urinate in the clean room. After spending most of the night, she couldn't help it. She was really afraid of side leaks even after a bit of movement. She only shouted carefully and said, "Your Majesty. After my death, the villain blackened again." Author, Ben Gongwei Pang. Chapter 1007. Yuan Jingdi slept sideways to her. Yan Ji turned her head and shouted at him, the two were facing each other. When she called him, her voice was very low, but the hot breath fell on Yuan Jingdi's face. Yuan Jingdi felt like he was being blown to the face by countless faces. Her mouth and nose were filled with her taste, and she seemed to have lost her breath. "Your Majesty." Yan Ji raised his hand and gently pushed his shoulder. The lowered voice was a little hoarse, as if it could scratch his heart. Yuan Jingdi felt that he must have had a problem with his ears before. How could such a voice be a man's voice? How could he never doubt it? I really want her to continue to call him a few times like this, but he is not good enough to sleep anymore, he can only open his eyes and look at her. The two were too close. "Your Majesty." Yan Ji's head hurriedly backed away to keep a distance with him, and realized that his frown was frowned, and her voice took a bit of embarrassment, "Your Majesty, I want to go for a little solution. Can you please find someone to come and help me?" Yuan Jingdi heard his words and frowned suddenly. Doesn't she know that she is a woman? Even asked him to find someone to help. All men in this army are men. Yuan Jingdi was a little bit angry, but when she said that, she blushed, and her eyes seemed to be filled with water vapor, her eyelashes were trembling, and she was like a kitten that was not weaned. "I was probably anxious about urinating." He resisted the urge to reach out and pinch her face, with a light expression, "I will do something like this. Just talk and get up to pick up the chamber pot." Yanj took his arm and stuttered, Your Majesty, this is His Majesty's room. How can you go here, Chen and Jing, and Chen to Jing?" When she pulled, Emperor Yuan Jing remembered that she was a woman, and it seemed that a woman could not use a night pot. Seeing her face flushed even more, he lost his mind of joking and teasing, "Okay, help you go." She stared at him with a strange expression on her face, and finally yielded, "Thank your Majesty." Emperor Yuanjing helped her to get up, and Yan Ji looked down and saw that he was wearing only a blouse, as if he had reacted, and then hurriedly asked him, "Your Majesty, who is the bandage?" Emperor Yuanjing helped her to walk forward step by step. When she saw that she was walking very slowly, she simply reached out and took it around her waist. He heard the words and looked impatiently, and only stared at her. Song Yi, he helped you pull out arrow. Yan Ji's face turned white, his eyelashes trembled, but he didn't speak. When he got to Jingfang, Yuan Jingbi asked her, "Need you to untie your pants?" She hurriedly shook her head. No, no, thank you, Your Majesty can go back first." Yuan Jingbi helped her to lower the curtain of Jingfang, but did not leave. Sure enough, after a while, she pushed open the door of Jingfang, and she took a small step with the door frame in one hand, moved outside the Jingfang, her head bowed, and whispered, "Hey, Your Majesty, I can't undo the belt." He tied her belt to a knot. She was injured in the chest, and her other hand could not be used. Only one hand could move freely, and it was no wonder that she could untie the knot. Yuan Jingbi was crying when she heard her voice, her head even lowered, her head seemed to be about to fall off. He didn't tease her, crouched down and helped her unfasten the belt. She hurried and didn't dare to look at him again. Nana's voice whispered, "Thank you," and rushed into the clean room again. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. After my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gong Weipang. Chapter 1008. When Yanj came out of Jingfang, she saw that Emperor Yuanjing was still waiting outside, and she looked up and looked down immediately, her face turned redder than just now. Yuan Jingbi asked her, "Are you ready?" Yan Ji was afraid he would come to help again, and said quickly, "Okay, okay." She bit her lip and probably wanted to talk, but in the end she said nothing. Emperor Yuanjing helped her and the two walked towards the room. When she went up the stairs, Yan Ji's feet were stunned, and the sound of exclaiming was half stuck, and he held back, because Yuan Jingbi not only held her for the first time, but also directly held her in her arms. Yanj laid his head on his chest and exposed him only with his back. In the moonlight, Emperor Yuanjing looked at her little red ears, her lips slightly raised, and her expression was pleasant. Until they hugged her to bed, both were silent and didn't speak again. Yanj narrowed herself to the bottom of the bed this time. But the quilt has only one bed. Two people covered a quilt, even if they were far away, they could catch each other by reaching out. Yuan Jingbi did not speak, but he wanted to see when she planned to confess. Early the next morning, Emperor Yuanjing left in armor. It wasn't until midnight 3 days later that he was covered in blood and dust. Yanj was already asleep, and he didn't startle her when he returned. He held the sword in his waist and stood beside the bed, slightly bowing his head, looking at her sleeping face. He helped her revenge, and the enemy's line of defense had been defeated. I want to tell her the news right away and see how she reacts when she hears it. But seeing her delicate face belonging to a woman, he put up with his thoughts and stared at her for a while before turning to the bathroom. After washing clean, Yuan Jingbi put on a lining and lay beside her. Thinking he couldn't sleep, but smelling the scent of medicine floating on her body, he soon fell into a lethargy. When Yuan Jingbi woke up again, he subconsciously reached out and touched the bed beside him. For the first time, the empty side gave him a spirit, and immediately he sat up and looked in the room. There is a dressing table in the room, and Yanj is sitting in front of the dressing table, combing her hair in front of the mirror. The ink fell, and the beauty sat on the chair with a thin waist, holding it, although it was only a back view, but she was wearing a single coat, and the exquisite curves of her back were exposed. He stared, and suddenly a place became hot. He stood up, walked in front of the mirror in a few steps, took the comb in her hand, and helped her comb her hair. The woman in the mirror had exquisite facial features. He thought that this was probably the most beautiful woman he had ever met. He was so beautiful that he could only look away from her face at a glance. The beauty frowned slightly, as if there was something on her mind. He faced the beauty in the mirror and asked softly, What are you thinking? Yanj, your majesty, my wound is almost healed, and I want to go out and lead a war. He wouldn't be surprised if she said such a thing with a serious face when the man was dressed up. But now she is a bright-eyed woman with bright red lips and beautiful eyes. Such a beautiful woman said such words in a serious voice, and he laughed when she heard it, and laughed without thinking. Yan Ji stared at the laughing emperor in the mirror. The serious expression on her face gradually became lost. She slowly raised her eyebrows, concealing the emotions in her eyes. After my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gong Wei Pang. Chapter 1009. Yuan Jingdi immediately noticed that the beauty was not in the right mood. He squeezed her flesh and cheeks and said, "No need, you are not injured yet. You can rest assured that your task is to heal your injuries now." The flesh on her face was so tender that she couldn't help but want to squeeze a few more times. Yuan Jingdi was never a person who would wrong him. When he thought so, he did the same. His hand slipped from her ears and landed on her neck. The air seems to be full of ambiguous. Yanj reached out and caught Yuan Jingdi's rough hands. Although her voice was indifferent, Su was weak because of her illness. "Your Majesty, what is this to do?" Yuan Jingdi bent over and hugged her, striding towards the bed. Yanj grabbed the lining of Yuan Jingdi's chest with his fingers, and his voice gasped slightly, "Your Majesty, do you want me to be your woman?" He didn't hesitate, "Yes." "But your Majesty, you have said that I am your favorite general and I am an invincible sword in your hands. The world is about to be settled. The general is useless, but when you are a woman, you are still your favorite person." He was so tempted, put her on the bed, undressed her clothes, and saw the wound on her shoulder. His voice softened more and more, "I will be lighter, don't be afraid." But she was used to being a general. For the first time as a woman, she was still very nervous. Her eyes were closed, her eyelashes were trembling, and her body was also trembling. On his waist. She couldn't help but finally wept lowly, "Your Majesty, I hurt. Yuan Jingdi also hurts." She was too nervous, her body was like a state of war. When he entered her body, he had the illusion of being broken by her sides. Looking up a little, you can see the tears in the corner of her eyes, drop by drop, slowly slipping into her chin. He lowered his head to kiss the corner of her eyes, and his fingers touched her. This was a white, greasy body, just like the good sheep fat jade. Everywhere was pleasing to the eye, but the hard scars on her body just ruined the beauty, just like jade had cracks. These scars on her were all left for him to fight around. Not only did he not think the scar was ugly, he looked at it, but his heart became more pitiful and his movements became softer. This is his woman. There was never a moment in which he was so eager to turn her into his own, and extremely patient, and guided her a little bit to relieve her tension. She probably couldn't help any more. She put her hands around his neck, her head sobbed silently in her arms, her shoulders shrugged, and she was aggrieved and pathetic. She couldn't bear it anymore, and she bit her mouth on his chest with her mouth open, and her fingers even scratched his shoulders. The chicken cub looked really curious and asked the words, "Does the woman's first time really hurt?" "Yanj, in the eyes of those who like it, it hurts. In the eyes of those who don't like it, it's nothing." The chicken couldn't understand it anymore. "You, a decisive general, haven't cried when you took an arrow from a wound on your shoulder. It's a bit arrogant now, right?" "Yanj, do you think I'm arrogant?" "Very sentimental." However, listening to the words of the song is not right. The chicken did not dare to continue to raise the bar. After my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gong Wei Pang. Chapter 1010. Yuan Jingdi wanted to keep herself sane. For the first time, she also had wounds on her body, which was not suitable for strenuous movements. But his body was not under control, especially when she was biting. the pain in his chest stimulated him to almost lose control. He slowed down and lowered his head to kiss her eyebrows. He did it for the first time. But unknowingly unfamiliar, but kissed, and lingered, never willing to move away. Later, his kiss fell on her crisscross scars. Her body was dodging, and he heard her mumble, "Ugly, don't. How ugly, this is her glory," but he felt distressed when he looked at it. He grabbed her to push his finger, kissed, and said in a dumb voice, "Shuchu, shuchu." When the two words were called out, he felt awful. He bit her red ear beads and sprayed a hot breath into her body, "Shuchu, shuchu." She didn't resist anymore. Although her lips were clenched stubbornly, she still hummed from time to time under his actions. The slender eyes were filled with water vapor, and the corners of the eyes were reddish. Zhang's face was enchanting and charming. Famous beauties are pregnant, Yuan Jingdi has never been more passionate. It was later that he discovered that the gauze on her shoulder had oozed blood. He was so excited that he got up and looked at her, only to find that she was pale and had passed out. Song Yuyi changed the medicine on his shoulder for Yanj. After thinking about it, he hesitated slightly and said to Yuan Jingdi, "General, her body can't stand any frustration." Her Majesty looked at her a lot, and the wound was quite deep. It's not always easy to get better with such a crack. Emperor Yuanjing nodded solemnly, but his heart was embarrassed. He has never been so forgetful. He obviously just wanted to taste it, and slowly swallowed her step by step. But later, he didn't even know how to control himself. Although his heart was annoyed, but those Chun Chun Guang made him think back, his body was numb. Song Yuyi still wanted to speak, but he saw the cold face of Emperor Yuanjing and swallowed it again when he reached his mouth. Yuan Jingdi asked him, "What else?" "This is a medicine for abrasions. Your Majesty can wipe the general, which is good for her body." Emperor Yuanjing wanted to ask him why he hadn't wiped it yet, but he could see Song Yuyi's flushed face and his dodgy gaze, the light and flint, and immediately understood that the medicine that Song Yuyi said should be touched. He nodded and took the medicine. Song Yuyi busy packed his medicine box, and exited the room a few steps around the screen. The escaped look was anxious to disappear into the sight of Yuan Jingdi. It was the first time that Yuan Jingdi had applied medicine to a woman. He lifted the quilt, and at the beginning he was only serious and dedicated to help her apply medicine. Gradually, she was attracted to her. For the first time, I stared at a woman's body, my heart pounding on my chest, and my fingers were shaking. Like a thief, I was afraid that she would wake up, but didn't want to walk through it, a little bit, curious to play with this strange thing. Everywhere in her seemed to have a fatal attraction to him. He later unknowingly, even bent over and kissed her between her legs. This is his treasure. The world knows that she is a general, but in the bed, she is under him. She conquered the world, he conquered her. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. After my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gong Weipang. Chapter 1011. The chicken curiously cried out, "This mighty man, he seems to like you, I thought he only likes the world in this plane." Endless confusion in the voice. I probably don't understand Yanj, such a broken body, and he hasn't performed any hookup techniques. Yanji used silence to show contempt for such a clever guy who doesn't understand humanity but also confesses himself. The chicken is more excited than before. He likes you, this is a good thing. The host's wishes will no longer be a problem, but will you be addicted to his likes and forget you before what you promise me? You said you wanted to give him the last edition, still wearing armor. Yanj, if you want him to continue blackening, I will kill him and make a specimen for you. Chicken. Even if this time he really loved the mighty one, the cub finally gave up his preferences for the sake of the overall situation. He grieved and said sadly to the song, "Would I give up my love for you, sacrifice too much? Many more, can you be nice to me in the future and think of me for anything good?" Yan's song, for example. "Chicken, the next time I meet the one I like, can't you grab it from me and put your hand in front of me?" Yanj, "I can do the first point, I can't do the second point. I can't satisfy you with this special hobby." Chicken, "Wipe, isn't Laozi trying to keep his favorite to caress with the day before yesterday? What special hobby is this, you discriminate against Laozi?" Yanj, "Ask Jiwei if he wants to be made into a specimen and be caressed by you every day." Chicken cub, "Roll thick, you have a piece of wood, where do you know what true love is? Laozi is true love. If you don't like him, Laozi will not do it." Yanj, "True love cries to death in the toilet." Chicken. Yanji directly shielded the roar of the cub, and his bones were loosened by Emperor Yuanjing for one night. He was very tired. Yanji ignored the Yuanjing emperor who was still studying somewhere and fell into a deep sleep. When he woke up again, Yuanjingdi was not around. Waiting for Yanji, the father-in-law, who always followed Yuanjingdi, saw the song sober, and immediately stepped forward to eat for the song. Yanji could not see the general's subordinates who fought with her. Father Gongqi asked again and again without knowing it. Almost half imprisoned in this small yard, Yanji was completely blind to the current war. A smeared state. Fortunately, I know that Emperor Yuanjing is not an ordinary person. Although Yanji looks anxious on the face, her heart is long and carefree, and she rarely enjoys such a quiet time. Emperor Yuanjing came back in the evening, and the dust returned, seeing Yanj standing at the door, apparently waiting for him, pulling Yanj into his arms. The father-in-law Qi is still on the side, Yanji busy reaching out to push him. Where did Yuanjingdi allow her to leave, grabbing her waist with both hands, and holding her in her arms so that her legs were close to her waist, he put one hand on her buttocks and asked, "Wait for me." The mood is obviously excellent. Yanj clutched his clothes tightly, heard the words down, and murmured Yuanjingdi kissed her on the crimson cheek, lowered her voice, and the hot breath fell on her face, "Want to do that kind of thing with you? After my death, the villain blackened again." Author, Ben Gong Weipang. Chapter 1012. In the words, the color was full. Where is this Emperor Yuanjing who only wants to dominate the world? Yanji was startled, looked up immediately, stared at him with wide eyes, and was about to shake his head to deny it, as if to react to his smirk. He seemed to be coaxing himself. She frowned, "Your Majesty." "Okay. Her body is very light, especially light." He held her like this, and he could pinch her thin waist half with a big palm, thinking of the delicate and explosive waist that swayed under him last night. My heart was about to move, at this moment watching her brow slightly twisted. "The beauty is really charming." "Your Majesty, the minister is talking to you seriously." Emperor Yuanjing was absent-minded and had already eaten at the table 2 dishes and 1 soup. For the soldiers, this meal was considered extravagant. He held her in a chair and did not set her aside, so that she nestled in her arms, stretched out chopsticks to pinch the vegetables, tasted good, and fed her. "Have you ever eaten?" His chopsticks were all close to his mouth. Yanj could not hide, he could only bite the dish into the mouth, shook his head when he heard it. "Wait when I come back to eat?" Yanji nodded, but immediately, it seemed as if he had responded to this remark with no intention, and he shook his head quickly. Chen has something to discuss with His Majesty." Yuanjingdi waited for her to stop talking and fed a piece of meat in her mouth. After Yanj finally chewed the meat and continued to talk, Yuanjingdi's second chopsticks came again. She didn't even have the chance to speak. This man is intentional. Yanj stared at him indignantly at first, staring at him, seeing that he was pretending not to see her, the corners of her eyes became red, and the eyelashes fluttered, and her eyes were covered with moisture. Emperor Yuanjing laughed and touched her belly and asked, "Are you full?" "Yanj, I'm full." Yuanjingdi put her on the table, got up and unbuttoned her pants. "Hey, see if you're hurt." Yanj ducked and reminded him, "Your Majesty, it hurts the chest." But she was now injured and had difficulty moving. Where could she hide his palms? He unbuttoned his pants a few times. He pulled her leg away and said in the middle of his mouth, "Last night you bleed. When I took your medicine in the morning, I was still red and swollen. I don't know what's going on." His face was serious, but his hands swam between her legs. Yanj struggled, and sobbed indignantly, "So, that's not hurt." Yuan Jingdi did not lift his head, but his voice was stubborn and could not be refuted, "You are bleeding." Yan Ji reached out his hand and covered his face, shouting, I'm the blood of virginity, I'm not a surgery, don't touch it, your majesty, please don't touch it, it's dirty." In the end, because of the touch of his fingers, his voice was sobbing with the meaning of begging. "Still a virgin?" Yuan Jingdi leaned down and kissed her red cheek. His mute voice asked lowly, "Are there no Su family?" She whimpered back, "Yes." Yuan Jingdi's body was stiff, and the fingers that were about to leave were affixed again. "Are people allowed? Is it a family relationship set by the parents?" Yan Song pursed her lips and said nothing. Yuan Jingdi pinched her chin, bit her mouth, and saw tears in the corners of her eyes, thinking that she was more powerful and lighter. "The man knows you are on the battlefield, he is willing to wait you." Yanj suddenly opened her mouth and bit her hand that he was going to help her wipe.